Salam alaikum. Commencer le nouvel an de l'Hégire 1446 par cette importante rencontre intitulée « Lisez-moi pour me comprendre ». Comprendre qui? Comprendre quoi? Comprendre Al-Coran, qui découle de cette belle civilisation, de cette belle religion islamique, fondée sur la paix, la solidarité, l'ouverture, les regards croisés pour plus de réflexions apaisées, pour une meilleure compréhension de l'islam. Ceci reflète la vision de l'ICESCO, qui est également fondée sur le partage de ce livre saint qui découle encore une fois de cette religion de paix, de savoir, de science, qui a fait naître les sciences, qui développent le vivre ensemble, qui développent surtout le partage, la solidarité. Al-Coran, je veux parler d'Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim. Aujourd'hui, pour cette rencontre, nous avons d'illustres savants, hommes de science venant du monde entier et surtout de l'Occident pour partager les regards croisés autour d'une lecture plus juste de cette belle religion qu'est l'islam à travers Al-Coran. Nous allons commencer par Dr Baptiste Brodard, qui est enseignant-chercheur d'islamologie à l'université d'Aix-Provence de Marseille. Dr Brodard a obtenu son doctorat en sciences sociales et sciences des religions en 2020 à l'université de Fribourg en Suisse. Il a mené des recherches postdoctorales à l'université au Mexique en se concentrant sur les communautés musulmanes en Colombie et au Mexique. Parallèlement, il s'intéresse beaucoup à l'évolution de la pensée islamique contemporaine et aussi à l'islam en société, en particulier dans le domaine du travail social, plaidoyer, de l'aide humanitaire. Je veux parler des conséquences, je veux parler des objectifs très concrets de cette religion, l'islam, à travers le Coran. Docteur Baptiste Brodard, la parole est à vous. Merci. Applaudissements, s'il vous plaît, à Docteur Brodard. Docteur Baptiste Brodard, nous sommes contents de vous entendre pour partager votre vision sur ce qui nous réunit aujourd'hui. Merci.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أبدأ بأشكر سيدي سفير الإيسيسكو والمنظمين وسيدة مباي لاستقبال وسأستمر بلغة الإنجليزية إن شاء الله. I will speak for about 15 minutes about quite controversial topics, so I hope I can bring different points to trigger a common debate after that. First, I would like to precise that my discussion would be about the French and Swiss context specifically. Based on my observation within the last decade, I would just speak about what happened from 2010 to 2024. And my purpose would be to address a critique of the current state of the field of Islamic studies in the West, but again, on Switzerland and France. I have experience in Islamic studies in both Muslim environments, mainly in Malaysia, but also in South Africa, but also in non-Muslim countries from Western Europe. And I could witness a very important gap between the approaches of both, the approach of Muslim believers in university and the approach of some of the Western academic circles that approach Islam mostly through deconstruction, through skepticism. Yet they speak about the same. They speak about Al-Quran, but with very diverse perspectives, with contradictory conclusions at some points. So I would like to mention a few points in a critical way to try to trigger a reflection all between us. First of all, as I was lecturing in Islamic studies in France, in one of the universities of the country, a lot of Muslim students came to me to complain about the institution. They said to me, when we attend Islamic courses, Islamic studies courses, we feel that the teachers, the lecturers, want to deconstruct our faith. So they begin to say that the Quran, al-Mushaf, نعرف بالإسلام كالقرآن الوحي. They say that this book may not be the Quran, but another text that came together a bit later. So for these students, that was a bit intrigued. They were intrigued by the situation because they just went to the course in order to try to get more knowledge about Islam, but they feel that all the teachings was against their faith, against what they learned in their own tradition with their own family. Secondly, I would speak about the approach to the Quran because the time is short, by giving these very dichotomous views on how we approach the Quran. On the one hand, Muslims approach the Quran with humility. In Morocco, we have a halaqah, al-hizb. كل يوم بعد صلاة الصبح كل يوم بعد صلاة المغرب نقرأ الحزب. We read the part of the Quran in a daily basis. It doesn't mean that the people who read the Quran or the hizb of the Quran understand the meaning. Still, they do it with the attitude of the believer, the attitude of someone who asks God for more insight, for more knowledge. We have also the example of Al-Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazari, last century or 2 centuries ago, who wrote in one of his books that he used to study Quran for his whole life before he started to understand the meaning of some verses. That's the attitude of humility. That's the attitude of patience, of sabr towards the Quran that Muslims want to have when they study the Holy Book. On the other hand, in some of the academic circles in the West, some people read Quran trying to find shortcomings, trying to find mistakes, trying to deconstruct it. Why I speak about that? Because the approach is very important, because it will orient it will guide the perception that the reader have on the book. Third, I will speak a bit about methodology and epistemology, but mostly methodology. Because if we go in the epistemological debate, which is very interesting too, talking about the al-bayan wal-burhan wal-irfan as diverse tools to access to knowledge, we will need much more time. But maybe we have a word about that issue a bit later. Methodology in the approach of the Quran is very important. Also, we find this same dichotomy between some of the Islamic studies department in France and Switzerland, on one hand, and on the other hand, we find a very contradictory or opposed approach in Muslim societies and environments. We can speak about the holistic approach versus the partialistic approach. In Muslim institutions, we would see the Quran as a whole book that cannot be disconnected. From Surah Al-Fatiha to Surah Al-Nas, there is a general cohesion that prevents the Muslim reader to take partialistically just one verse and to ignore the other ayat. Whereas in some of the non-Muslim academic environments, sometimes they focus on one specific verse and they would develop years of study of one specific surah without considering the whole book in its entirety. Also, another shortcoming I found in some of the Western departments of Islamic studies is the fact to study the Quran as the gospel, or the new gospel. But the status of both books are totally different, especially when talking about the second gospel, as it looks more like a book of ahadith or traditions, meaning that the companions of Jesus, of Isa alayhi salam, said that they witness things, so they give an interpretation. But the status of the Quran for Muslim believers is the word of God which has been revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So it's very tricky to approach both books as if they are a sole phenomenon. I would add that we have to consider the polysemic nature of the Quranic verses as well. Polysemic meanings showing that one verse can be understood in different ways, which makes the translations very difficult. We have the example in Surah At-Takathur, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhaakum At-Takathur hatta zurtum al-maqabir. Well, this part, hatta zurtum al-maqabir, has two different meanings, at least, according to the tafasir. And it shows that the complexity of the Quran takes time to be approached, again, with humility, because one verse doesn't mean only a specific meaning. Then we have diverse dimensions of knowledge. In the Tasawwuf tradition, we have this interpretation of the Quran with a more internal view that doesn't contradict it, that doesn't go in contradiction with the external or more direct interpretation of the Quran. Because one interpretation doesn't prevent another interpretation to be true, since the Quran is viewed as a sacred book that encompasses a lot of knowledge, a lot of different aspects. Then the approach requires dedication and patience. And I was surprised during my experience in some of the Islamic departments in Switzerland and in France that Quranic studies or in Islamic studies departments, when they study the Quran, often they wouldn't invite Muslim scholars that dedicated their whole life to study the Quran, maybe 30, 40 years, but they were considered as not legitimate by the institution because they are not part of the system and they don't have the same approach. Now I would like to speak a bit about these approaches or these premises. I think that's the key point here, the bottom line, between diverse interpretations of the Quran or between diverse approaches to the study of the Quran. Premises, assumptions always exist because nobody is neutral and nobody starts from scratch. The Muslim premise or the Muslim assumption is that the Quran is the wahi or the revelation from Allah. So he will read, she or he will read the text with that in mind, that comes from above, that's sacred, that encompass meanings, so even if they can't understand the meaning, they will struggle to continue reading, continue studying with care. Other academics, of course, it depends on the scholars, because we have very non-Muslim, very high and interesting contributions throughout the history. Even recently, we have, for instance, since we are in Rabat, we have Jacques Berck, a big scholar who was not Muslim, but he approached the Quran with this humility, with this intention to try to understand the Quran as understand Muslims. But besides, we also find in some of the academic environments some people trying to approach the Quran with skepticism and with the intention to deconstruct it, to find incoherence, to find mistakes, and some dedicate years of that. Why is it so? Should it be like that in the academia? Officially, it shouldn't be the case. Officially, it should be the place for sciences or for objectivity, or as long as we try to understand objectivity as a direction, not as a destination. But for some, because of ideological reasons, political agenda, the Quran is viewed as a problematic book that has to be deconstructed. Why? Because it goes against some ideas of secularism, or against some of the ideas of postmodernism, or against concepts like progressivism for some. And I think that the honesty would be to put words on these assumptions and to declare from where we start, in order that the public is aware of the ideological and the political intentions or agenda that can orientate some of these projects, because it's things we witness a lot today. So I will continue talking about that for the last minutes by taking the high controversial issue of Islamophobia, or hostility towards Muslims, because unfortunately, in some of the academic institutions, we still find Islamophobia, meaning that Islamic studies departments are full of professors that express a distance with Islamic belief. It's hardly, in some institutions, it's even difficult to find Muslim scholars, because as long as someone is known for having faith in this revelation, is considered as non-adequate or suspect for the institution, and it wouldn't be hired. And that's the sad reality we witness in quite a lot of Western countries up to date, which is well known, but which nobody wants to talk about. Again, I would end up this conference by going outside of the academia, because only a few minutes are remained, to say that the West also gave space for diverse approaches to the Quran coming from Muslim communities. And we find somehow a wider perspective, a wider range of perspectives about the Quran, because of the freedom of speech Muslim institutions can have, mostly outside of the academia. And we have, of course, traditionalist or neo-traditionalist views on the Quran that would approach the book through the mediation of the school of thought, of the madahib, or of the school of al-aqidah, kal-ash'ariyya, wal-mutaridiyya, wal-athariyya, and so. But also we find a lot of so-called reformist Muslim scholars who approach the Quran with new lenses, and who proposed new interpretations of the Quran in order to renew the understanding of this book. It was also made possible in the West by the absence of coercive authorities on the process of Islamic thought, but again, it's found mostly out of the academia. To give a very brief conclusion, I would say that some of the Islamic studies approach in the West are unfortunately still affected by the very idea of the clash of civilization. Some people, including in university, continue to think that Islam is a problem and that Islam can go against the so-called Western values or the so-called agendas that always change according to the context. For that reason, sometimes we find a very aggressive approach under the name of scholarship that goes hardly to try to deconstruct the very fundamentals of Islam, including the principle of wahi. This is not a new topic, but this is still happening to this day. Yet the Quran brings its own responses to clash of civilization. The Quran advocates for mutual understanding and peace between civilizations, between cultures, and between religions, as we find evidence in different verses, in different ayat. For instance, in Surah Al-Hajj, there is a verses in which Allah speaks about the fact to protect monastery and churches, not only masajid, but also kana'is, which is a proof and an evidence of this respect that Islam gives to the religious diversity at least in his fundamental book, the Quran. Also, we find in Surah Al-Hujurat, in the verse 13, ayat that is always mentioned, to call humanity for mutual understanding, emphasizing the principle of universality. As Allah said, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa unsa, wa ja'alnakum shu'uba wa qaba'il li ta'arafu. Inna akramakum 'indallahi atqakum, innallahu alimun khabir. This verse by itself shows this idea of diversity, human diversity, and the will of Allah for humans to know each other, to establish mutual understanding, and not to fight each other, but to know each other, to get to know each other. And that's a verse we like to remember and to remind and to meditate. أشكر لكم وجزاكم الله خير والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Dr. Baptiste Brodard, for this very inspiring communication, highlighting the holistic approach of Islam as an umbrella for humanity, highlighting also the impact of Quran in our day-to-day life in terms of humanity, in terms of solidarity, but also in terms of patience. Nous allons maintenant passer la parole à professeur Mike Hardy,